Have you ever agreed to something that felt wrong just to feel seen again? Edward Kane, a powerful CEO with everything on paper and nothing in his heart, received a wedding invitation from the woman who once promised him forever and left him for someone richer. So he made a choice. He hired someone to be his date, not for love, but for pride. Claire Bennett, a quiet, self-made woman who'd spent years rebuilding herself after betrayal, said yes, not for the money, not even out of curiosity, but because something in her wanted to feel chosen, if only once. But what happens when a fake relationship starts to feel real? What would you do if you found out the affection, the connection, the quiet moments you believed in were born out of someone else's plan for revenge? Would you walk away? Or would you stay and ask, what if this time it's different? This is a story about mistakes that matter, choices that define us, and love that grows not from perfection, but from the courage to begin again. If this story stirs something in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin. It was the kind of wedding invitation that didn't belong in Edward Kane's mailbox anymore. The cream-colored envelope, hand-addressed in elegant script, sat awkwardly between a water bill and a subscription catalog. He stared at it for a full minute, standing in the hallway of his Denver loft, before finally tearing the flap open with a sigh. Inside was an invitation to the wedding of Samantha Monroe and Charles Whitmore, her new fiancé. A hedge fund guy from Connecticut with a chin like a magazine cover and a wine cellar worth more than Edward's first company. He read the words slowly. June 8th, Willow Creek Ranch, Montana. Formal attire. No kids. Edward leaned against the wall, one hand raking through his silver-tinged hair. He was 47 CEO of a growing tech firm, respected by peers, feared by competitors. But at that moment, he felt hollow, like a page torn from an old book no one reads anymore. It wasn't that he still loved Samantha. No, that ship had sailed years ago. But the invitation brought back memories not of love, but of disappointment, of giving everything and still being the man left behind. And then, like lightning slicing through a placid sky, a wild idea crept in. Not revenge. No, he told himself, just balance. A chance to walk into that wedding with his head high and something unexpected on his arm. Someone who would make Samantha pause. Someone who would make her question what she gave up. He didn't need a model. He didn't want some glossy smile or temporary trophy. He needed real. Someone smart, composed. Someone who would surprise them all. That's when he thought of Claire Bennett. She had worked with his company as a freelance operations strategist nearly 2 years ago. Remote, efficient, brilliant in the quietest way. He remembered how her emails were always precise, her tone professional, but never cold. Occasionally, she'd slip in a line of dry humor that made him chuckle in the middle of board meetings. He never met her in person, but she stuck with him. Opening his laptop, Edward found her contact info still saved under Bennett. C. Freelancer. Strategic Ops. With a slow breath, he began typing an email that felt stranger with every line. Claire, I hope this message finds you well. I have a rather unconventional request, and before you dismiss it entirely, I promise it's harmless, legal, and compensated fairly. I'd like to hire you for a weekend event as my date. It's not romantic, and no pretense beyond the evening is expected. I simply need someone intelligent, composed, and quick on their feet. You came to mind instantly. I can offer $3,000 for the weekend. Travel and accommodations included? I'll understand if this isn't for you, but if you're curious, I'd be happy to explain more. Edward Kane. He hesitated, reread, then pressed send. 2 days passed with no reply. Edward told himself he didn't care. He buried himself in meetings, proposals, performance reviews, but the invitation stayed on his desk like a dare, like a whisper from the past. Then, late Thursday evening, a reply popped into his inbox. Mr. Kane, your message was surprising, to say the least. I've reread it 3 times just to make sure it wasn't a prank. I admit I'm intrigued, though I have questions. Many. Let's talk. Claire Bennett. He exhaled, half relieved, half anxious. This was happening. They met at a quiet cafe just outside Boulder, nestled between a second-hand bookstore and a florist. Claire arrived 10 minutes early, as he expected she would. She wore a soft navy cardigan, jeans, and practical shoes. Her dark blonde hair was pulled into a loose bun, and glasses rested gently on the bridge of her nose. She stood as he approached. Mr. Kane, she said, offering a firm handshake. Claire. He nodded. Thank you for meeting me. They sat near the window, the spring sunlight pooling gently around them. Claire didn't waste time. Let's be clear, this is the most bizarre job proposal I've received. And I once got asked to mediate a dispute between 2 CEOs over who got the corner office. Edward chuckled. I believe it, but yes, this is unusual, and I wouldn't blame you for walking out now. I'm not walking, she said simply. I just want to understand. Why me? He leaned back, considering. Because you're the kind of woman who doesn't play games. You're smart, steady, unshakable. That's exactly what I need. And this wedding, it's someone important. It's my ex-fiancé, he admitted. She left me for someone with more zeros in their net worth. Now she's marrying him, and I've been invited to celebrate their happily ever after. Claire looked at him for a long moment. And you want me to help you look unbothered? He smiled, almost sheepish. Something like that. She took a sip of her tea. You know I'm not an actress. Right, that's exactly why I thought of you. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the wind rustled the tulips in the florist's display. Finally, Claire spoke. I'm not saying yes yet, but if I did hypothetically, it would be on my terms. No physical contact unless we both agree, no awkward after-dinner expectations, and you're honest with me, always. Edward nodded. Absolutely. You'd be my partner in a social charade. Nothing more. She studied him, eyes narrowing slightly. Then, with a half-smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, she said, Then let's call it a trial run. I've got a free weekend, and I've always wanted to see Montana. Claire Bennett had never been one for impulsive decisions. Her life, since the divorce, had been a series of careful calculations, every bill paid, every grocery list made with coupons in mind, even her weekly routine freelance work in the morning, watercolor practice in the afternoon. Grocery shopping every other Thursday ran like clockwork. But Edward Kane's offer had thrown a wrench into the quiet predictability she'd built around herself. $3,000 for a weekend. travel included, to attend a wedding as his date. Claire sat on the edge of her small porch in Boulder, her knees pulled up to her chest, watching the last traces of dusk settle over her overgrown front yard. A squirrel darted across the sidewalk, startling a neighborhood cat. Somewhere down the street, a screen door slammed, and a kid's laughter carried on the wind. She held Edward's email printed out in her hand, as if it might offer new meaning the 100th time she read it. The money was tempting, not because she was broke, though things had been tight since she left her full-time job, but because she wanted to sign up for a master class in narrative design, something she'd dreamed of for years. But always, something else came first: her daughter's braces, the leaky roof, her mother's medical bills, and now, this man, this CEO from Denver whom she barely knew, wanted to pay her to play his partner for one weekend. She thought back to her short contract with Kane Tech. Edward had been a name behind emails, firm, polished, sometimes too efficient, but he'd always been respectful, and when she left, he'd sent a personal note of thanks rare for a man in his position. Still, the idea unsettled her. She remembered her ex-husband, Greg, the way he once made her laugh over burnt toast and coffee on Saturday mornings, the way he later made her cry with silence and disdain. He had called her boring once, said she lacked spark. That was right before he left her for a yoga instructor 10 years younger. Claire had never forgotten how small those words made her feel, how deeply they cut. Was she doing this to prove something to someone else or herself the next morning? Claire made coffee and opened her laptop. The inbox blinked with new freelance assignments, bills, newsletters, a reminder from her dental insurance. But her eyes went to the draft email she'd saved the night before. She clicked send. Friday afternoon came quickly. Claire, dressed in a soft sweater, ankle boots, and light makeup, a touch of color on her cheeks and lips. Just enough. She wasn't going to pretend to be someone she wasn't. If this was going to work, she needed to be entirely herself. The coffee shop where they agreed to meet had a rustic charm: wooden beams, faded armchairs, the scent of cinnamon and espresso in the air. Edward was already there when she arrived, seated at a corner table, reviewing something on his tablet. He stood as soon as he saw her. "Claire," he said, smiling with a sincerity that surprised her. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Neither was I," she admitted. He gestured for her to sit. "I appreciate it. Truly, I know this is odd." She raised an eyebrow, setting her bag down. "That's one word for it." He laughed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, if at any point this feels uncomfortable, you're free to walk. No hard feelings. I'll still pay you for your time." Claire nodded slowly. "Let's just talk today. No decisions yet. I want to understand what exactly I'm agreeing to." "Of course," he said, folding his hands. He outlined the plan: attending the wedding, posing as a couple, blending in but not overdoing it. "You don't need to pretend to be someone else. I just need company and someone who can handle a little social gymnastics." "And the purpose?" Claire asked pointedly. Edward paused. "I won't lie. I want to walk in there and not look like the guy who got left behind. I don't want her pity." Claire studied him. "Is that really for you, or is it still about her?" The question hung in the air. He looked down, maybe both. They talked for over an hour, not just about the wedding, but about their lives. Claire told him about her teenage daughter, now off at college in Oregon, about her watercolor sketches and the dream of someday opening a small community art studio. Edward listened, asked questions, told her he used to write short stories in college, once dreamed of teaching literature before tech took over his life. It wasn't what she expected. There was vulnerability beneath the polished exterior. Weariness, too. As the conversation slowed, Claire reached for her cup, now lukewarm. "You do realize this is completely insane," she said softly. Edward smiled. "I do." She stared at the swirling coffee in her cup, then set it down with a quiet clink. "I'll do it," she said. He blinked. "You will, but only if we keep it simple. No fake backstory, no elaborate romantic drama. You tell your friends I'm your date. I smile. I drink wine. We survive the weekend. Then it's over." "Deal," Edward said, relief washing over his face. She held up a finger, "And I pick my own dress." He grinned. "I wouldn't dare suggest otherwise." The first rehearsal, as Edward jokingly called it, took place on a rainy Saturday afternoon at a wine bar near downtown Denver. Claire arrived with a notebook in hand. She looked at him with a raised brow and said, "If I'm going to play your girlfriend for a weekend, I need background, who you are, what we've shared, how long we've been together. Give me the script." Edward couldn't help but smile. "You're treating this like a real consulting project." She shrugged. Old habits die hard. They sat by the window, the rain streaking down like soft piano notes across the glass. A server brought their drinks, an Oregon Pinot Noir for her, an old-fashioned for him. "I figured we met at a conference," Edward began, "something respectable but believable. You were speaking on remote team strategies. I was intrigued by how well you handled questions." Claire took a slow sip. "Flattering." He leaned in a bit. "Then I asked you to dinner. You said no." She smiled. "That sounds more like me." But we kept in touch. He added, "Over emails. Eventually, I convinced you to meet again." One lunch led to another. Claire tilted her head. "We've been together for how long?" He considered. 4 months. Still new, but serious. She jotted it down. Any shared interests? Books, wine, disdain for small talk. Claire smirked. "That works." As the afternoon unfolded, what started as a scripted exercise turned into something else. Edward found himself telling her things he hadn't spoken out loud in years. How he used to visit his grandmother's farm every summer in Nebraska. How he missed real silence, the kind that doesn't come with email notifications and back-to-back Zoom calls. Claire shared, too, not just the polished parts of herself, but the cracks, her fear of growing older alone. How she sometimes stared at the blank canvas for hours before daring to paint a single line. How she still kept her ex-husband's last birthday card, unread, tucked in the back of her dresser drawer, not because she missed him, but because she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. There were no violins, no accidental hand touches, just words, honest, unvarnished, the kind that fill a space with something real. The second rehearsal was less structured. They met at a small vintage market on a whim. Edward needed a tie for the wedding, and Claire insisted he could do better than navy and stripes. "Try this one," she said, holding up a burgundy silk tie with faint golden dots. He looked skeptical. "I'll look like a magician. You'll look like a man who doesn't blend into the wallpaper," she replied, when he tried it on in the cracked mirror by the vendor stall. Claire tilted her head. "It suits you," she said simply. They wandered the stalls for nearly an hour. Claire pointed out ceramic mugs shaped like foxes and old cookbooks with handwritten notes in the margins. Edward bought her a leather-bound sketch pad after she paused a little too long at the stand. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Touched," he replied. "You didn't have to come to Montana with me, either." She looked away, hiding the small smile tugging at her lips. That evening they had dinner at a quiet bistro, going over final prep for the wedding. Claire pulled out her notebook again. "So, your favorite wine is Barolo," he answered, swirling his glass, "and yours Chardonnay, but only the buttery kind. I'm picky." He laughed. "That tracks." Claire leaned forward. "Serious now, Edward, this wedding isn't just about appearances, is it?" He hesitated. "No, it's not." She waited. He looked down at his hands. "She's Samantha she left when I was at my most distracted. I was building the company, missing dinners, flying coast to coast. I don't blame her for walking away, but I blamed myself for a long time. This wedding, it feels like a verdict." Claire nodded slowly. "You think showing up with me changes the verdict?" "I think it changes the story," he said quietly. Claire didn't answer right away. Instead, she said, "Then let's write a good one." Later that night, Claire sat in her car before heading home. She stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Same face, same lines, same glasses slipping slightly down her nose. But something felt different. Not in a fairy tale way, not in the butterflies and stars sense. No, this was something quieter, like the warmth of sun on old wood, like remembering a song from your childhood after forgetting it for years. And just for a moment, she let herself wonder, what if none of this had to be pretend? Willow Creek Ranch stretched like a memory across the horizon. Golden fields swayed under the June sun, and rows of white chairs faced a small wooden altar overlooking the distant Rockies. Wildflowers had been carefully arranged into vintage milk jugs along the aisle, and guests in linen suits and flowing dresses mingled under strings of Edison bulbs that hung from tree to tree. It was the kind of wedding Samantha Monroe had always dreamed of, charming, rustic, expensive, everything curated down to the last lavender-scented napkin. Edward Kane stepped out of the rented black SUV and looked at the scene before him with a composed face and a silent storm brewing behind his eyes. Claire Bennett stepped out beside him, adjusting the hem of her forest green dress. It was simple, tasteful, and undeniably elegant. Her hair was pulled back in a soft twist, and a delicate silver chain rested at her collarbone. She looked up at him. "You okay?" He nodded. "I've been in tougher rooms." She smiled gently. "You mean like shareholder meetings?" "Exactly." They walked side by side toward the gathering crowd. For a moment, no one noticed. Then a few turned. Whispers floated. Someone nudged someone else. And just like that, eyes began to follow them. Inside the reception barn, wooden beams, white lights, jazz trio in the corner, Edward introduced Claire to a few colleagues, former friends, and distant cousins he hadn't spoken to in years. Claire played her role with quiet grace. She laughed at the right moments, asked thoughtful questions, and never once appeared rattled. She had a way of making people feel seen, even in a room where everyone was performing. But Edward saw more. He saw the way her fingers curled slightly when Samantha's name was mentioned, the way she caught his eye before every conversation, like a silent check-in, and then she appeared. Samantha Monroe entered the barn like she still owned the room. Her golden hair flowed in soft waves, and the diamond on her hand flashed like a warning light. She wore a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Trailing behind her was Charles Whitmore, tall, tailored, and perfectly forgettable. Samantha's gaze landed on Edward. She paused, just for a second, then walked over, glass of champagne in hand, her smile widening. "Well," she said, "if it isn't Edward Kane." "Samantha," he replied, keeping his voice even. Her eyes shifted to Claire. "And this must be Claire Bennett?" Claire said smoothly, offering a hand. "Lovely wedding." Samantha took the hand, briefly, and gave a glance up and down. "Thank you. It's been everything I imagined." "I can tell," Claire replied, her tone warm but unreadable. "The attention to detail is impressive." Samantha tilted her head, clearly trying to gauge her. "So, Claire, what do you do?" "I'm a strategist," Claire said. "Freelance, mostly." "Oh," Samantha said, as if it were a foreign concept. "Well, Edward has always been good at spotting potential." There was a flash in Claire's eyes, just a glimmer, but her voice remained calm. "That's kind of him. And true? He's very intuitive." Samantha's smile flickered. Charles returned with a second glass and placed a hand lightly on Samantha's waist. Edward nodded to him. "Charles, Edward, good to see you," he said, without much conviction. There was a pause, brief but thick. "Well," Samantha said, her tone a bit tighter now, "enjoy the evening." She turned with Charles, walking away with the grace of someone who wanted to be watched. Claire waited a beat, then turned to Edward. "That went well." Edward exhaled. "You handled that like a pro." She smiled. "I've had practice. Mothers-in-law, office politics." This was child's play. Later, after the ceremony and during the dancing, Claire found herself on the edge of the patio, looking up at the Montana stars. They were clearer than she remembered from any other place. Edward joined her, 2 glasses of wine in hand. He passed one to her without a word. They stood quietly for a moment, letting the night settle around them. Then Edward spoke. "You didn't have to defend me in there." Claire looked at him. "I didn't. I was defending myself." He turned to her. "Why did you say yes to all this?" She hesitated. "Because you asked. Because I needed the money. But also—" He waited. "Because I wanted to feel like a part of something again, even if it was pretend." Edward studied her face. "It doesn't feel pretend," he said softly. Claire looked away, blinking against something she didn't want to name. In the distance, a song began to play, soft, slow, a country ballad that somehow fit the moment perfectly. "Dance with me?" Edward asked. Claire hesitated just long enough for it to mean something, then nodded. They stepped into the open, under the soft glow of hanging lights. No one paid them much attention, and that was exactly how it should be. They danced in silence, and, for the first time, neither of them was performing. The morning after the wedding was unusually still. Sunlight poured through the wide windows of the lodge where Edward and Claire had stayed 2 separate rooms. As agreed, the scent of pine and freshly brewed coffee filled the air, but the hum of celebration had vanished, just the occasional murmur of guests preparing to leave, a suitcase rolling across the floor, quiet footsteps in the hallway. Claire stood on the back porch with her coffee mug, wearing a soft flannel and jeans, watching a deer in the distance nibble at the edge of the property. There was something about Montana mornings that made everything feel older, more honest. Edward joined her minutes later, 2 cups in hand. He passed her a refill. "Sleep okay?" he asked. She nodded. Didn't expect to. But yes. There was a pause. Comfortable, but not quite relaxed. "I think we pulled it off," he said, with a small smile. Claire looked out toward the fields. "Did we?" Before he could answer, a familiar voice called out from behind them. "Look who's still playing house." It was Graham Peterman, an old colleague of Edward's, a little too loud, a little too smug, the kind of man who always had one drink too many and never realized he should stop talking. Edward tensed. "Graham." Graham walked over with a lazy grin, nodding at Claire. "So, you're the mystery woman. Gotta hand it to you. Kane hiring someone who actually talks like she's read a book inspired." Claire stiffened. "Excuse me." Graham chuckled. "No offense. I mean, you're clearly good at what you do. I just didn't think the whole fake girlfriend gig still existed outside of movies." Silence. Sharp, cutting silence. Claire's eyes slowly turned to Edward. What is he talking about? Edward opened his mouth, closed it. Time slowed. Claire. But it was too late. She stepped back, her face pale. "Is that what I was hired? Help to make you look like you'd moved on?" "It started that way," Edward said quickly, his voice thick. "But God, Claire, everything after it changed. I changed." She stared at him, every breath shallower than the last. "You should have told me," she whispered. "I was going to." He said I was just afraid of what she asked, her voice rising, that I'd say no, that I'd be hurt, that I'd stop playing, pretend. Edward stepped closer. "Afraid of losing you, even before I had you." She blinked hard, the first hint of tears stinging. "You never had me." "Edward, not really." She turned and walked back into the lodge. He didn't follow. The drive home was silent. Claire didn't answer his texts, didn't open his emails. When he called, it rang until voicemail, and he never left a message. He returned to Denver with a weight pressing on his chest, like something beautiful and fragile had slipped through his fingers. And he had no one to blame but himself. Claire went back to Boulder, back to her routines, but something in her had shifted. She tried to pick up where she left off. Freelance contracts, quiet mornings, watercolor afternoons, but the colors didn't feel the same. The air in her house felt stale. One afternoon, while unpacking the last of her suitcase, she found the sketch pad Edward had bought her at the vintage market. She almost tossed it aside. Instead, she opened to a blank page and began to draw. Meanwhile, Edward tried everything. Flowers arrived at Claire's door, sunflowers. Not roses, her favorite. Books she once mentioned in passing appeared in the mail, along with handwritten notes in the margins. One day, she received a tiny package. Inside was a watercolor brush set, wrapped in linen with a single post-it note. For the colors you haven't painted yet? E. She never replied, but she didn't throw it away. Weeks passed. Edward signed up for a community writing workshop in Boulder, the same one Claire had once dreamed of attending. He didn't tell anyone. He just showed up, week after week, hoping she'd walk through the door. She didn't, but Claire heard. A friend mentioned seeing him in the library basement with a small group of writers, sharing stories and listening, really listening. She didn't know what to make of that, didn't want to believe it meant anything, but part of her did. Part of her remembered the quiet honesty in his voice the night they danced, the way he looked at her, not like a man playing a role, but like a man seeing someone for the first time, and for the first time since that morning in Montana. Claire cried, not out of anger or humiliation, but out of sadness, because something had almost been real, and now she wasn't sure if it still could be. The silence stretched for weeks. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from anger or pride or even resentment. It was heavier than that, a silence born of disappointment, of the fragile string of trust snapped too early, too suddenly, leaving nothing to hold on to but fragments of what could have been. Edward Kane wasn't used to waiting. He was a man who moved fast, made decisions quickly, solved problems with precision. But Claire Bennett wasn't a problem to be solved. She was a person, a story he'd disrupted with his selfishness. And now, if he wanted to be part of that story again, he had to earn his way back in, quietly, carefully, honestly. He didn't text again after the third unanswered message. He didn't email. Instead, he showed up at the writing workshop every Thursday evening at the Boulder Public Library. Not because he hoped Claire would walk in, but because he wanted to understand her world, the one he'd barged into without permission. It was a small class, maybe 8 people total. A retired literature teacher, a young dad writing bedtime stories, a widower working through grief by crafting poems about his garden, and Edward Tech CEO, pen shaking slightly as he tried to write a single authentic sentence. The first piece he shared was about his grandfather's barn in Nebraska, the hayloft, the old record player, the smell of engine oil and fresh pie. He read it aloud, unsure of his voice, but the group listened, encouraged, no judgment. He kept going. Each week, a little more of himself slipped onto the page, not the version on press releases or company bios, the version that stayed quiet at dinners, that never told anyone how much he missed his mother's lullabies or how lost he'd felt when Samantha left. And slowly, he realized this wasn't for Claire anymore. This was for him. Meanwhile, Claire lived her days like she had before Edward. Work, paint, laundry, coffee, repeat. But nothing felt the same. There was an ache now, not a sharp one, not the kind that demanded attention, but dull and constant, like a bruise you'd forgotten until something brushed against it. She tried to distract herself with projects, clients, a weekend road trip to Santa Fe. But Edward's presence lingered in odd places, an extra toothbrush still in her guest drawer, the sound of a piano piece he once hummed under his breath playing in a cafe, the sketch pad he bought resting on her windowsill. One afternoon, she picked it up again, and, without really thinking, she began to draw, not landscapes, like usual, but people. A woman standing at a train station, A man watching her from a distance, neither moving, both waiting. A week later, a small brown envelope arrived in her mailbox. Inside was a short note, handwritten in Edward's familiar, slanted print. No more gestures, no more noise. Just this: I miss our conversations. I miss the person I was becoming when I was around you. If this is goodbye, I'll respect it. But if it's not, I'll be at Novel Grounds on Tuesday at 7. No expectations. Just tea. Yours, E. Claire read it twice, then 3 more times. She left it on the kitchen counter for a full day before deciding. Tuesday evening came with a soft drizzle, the kind of rain that didn't demand an umbrella, just a little patience. Claire stepped into Novel Grounds, the cozy book cafe on the corner of 7th and Maple, where quiet readers nestled in overstuffed chairs, and the scent of cinnamon and old pages lingered in the air. Edward was already there. He stood as soon as he saw her, unsure whether to smile. Claire slid into the seat across from him. Neither spoke at first. Then she said quietly, "You look tired." He smiled faintly. "It's been a long month." She nodded. "I got your note. I meant every word." Claire looked down at her hands. "I was really hurt, Edward, not just because of what you did, but because I let myself believe it could be something real." His voice was steady, low. It was real. "After the first night, after I saw you walk into that coffee shop, nothing about it felt fake anymore. I just didn't have the courage to tell you before Graham ruined it." "You should have told me," she whispered, "before it became too late. I know." A pause. "I've been going to a writing workshop," he said. Claire blinked, surprised. "You?" He nodded. "Every Thursday. I figured if I wanted to understand why that weekend meant so much to me, I had to learn to say it properly. Honestly." She watched him. And I learned I'm not very good at metaphors." She laughed softly, but truly. The silence that followed was different now. Not heavy, not tense, just open. "Why did you ask me that day?" she asked. Out of all the people you could have hired, why me? Edward looked her in the eyes. "Because you didn't look like the kind of woman who'd let me lie to myself." Claire didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out the sketch pad. She opened to a page, the one with the woman and the man at the station. "I drew this after Montana," she said. "I didn't know what it meant until just now." He looked at the drawing. His breath caught somewhere between his ribs and his throat. "You still waiting?" he asked. She closed the book slowly. "No," she said. "I think I'm ready to walk forward." The second time Edward and Claire met at Novel Grounds, they didn't talk about the past. There was no mention of Montana, no lingering stares across wedding tables, no mention of the moment it all cracked open like thin ice. Instead, they talked about books. Claire had just finished rereading East of Eden. Edward confessed he'd never read it, which earned him a dramatic gasp and an immediate recommendation. She lent him her copy, worn and dog-eared, with notes in the margins. That night, he stayed up until 2 in the morning, reading the first 7 chapters. Not to impress her, just to understand what moved her. Over the next few weeks, their meetings became a quiet rhythm. Wednesday evening coffee. Sunday morning walks through the Boulder Farmers Market, a shared table at the library where she sketched and he wrote. No grand gestures, no expectations, just space. And in that space, something gentle began to grow. One Sunday, Claire invited Edward to join her for a local art exhibit she was contributing to. Nothing big, just a community event in a renovated warehouse with string lights, folding chairs, and homemade lemonade in plastic cups. Her painting, hung at the far end of the gallery, showed a woman alone at a bus stop. Night falling, no one else in sight. Edward stood in front of it for a long time. Claire joined him quietly. "Is she waiting?" he asked. Claire shook her head. She was. But now she's deciding if she wants to keep waiting or start walking. He nodded. "It's beautiful." She looked at him, her voice soft. "Thank you for showing up. I always wanted to," he said. "I just didn't know how." One evening in early fall, they cooked dinner together at Claire's house. It was a simple meal, roasted vegetables, grilled chicken, a glass of wine. Claire played Nina Simone on the speaker. Edward chopped garlic, too slowly, and she laughed, correcting his grip on the knife like a teacher showing a student for the first time. After dinner, they sat on the porch wrapped in old quilts, sipping warm cider as the wind picked up. The air smelled of firewood and fallen leaves. Edward turned to her. "I think," he said, "the real mistake I made wasn't lying about the wedding." Claire looked at him. "I think the mistake was assuming you'd never say yes to the truth." She didn't speak right away. Then she said, "Maybe I wouldn't have." "Back then," he nodded, accepting. "But now," she added, "I'm listening." They still had boundaries. Claire didn't want to be called girlfriend. Not yet. She wasn't ready for labels. Edward didn't push. He stopped trying to orchestrate every moment. He let silences exist, let questions breathe before he answered them. He even stopped checking his phone during conversations, something Claire noticed and appreciated quietly. At a bookstore one Saturday afternoon, they browsed separately for nearly half an hour. Edward found her in the poetry section, flipping through a volume of Mary Oliver. He held up a worn hardcover, The Great Gatsby. "I figured it's time I read what I lied about reading in college." Claire smirked. "I'll quiz you on the symbolism of the green light next week." They walked out with 3 books and 2 cups of chai. It wasn't perfect. They still had awkward moments, misunderstandings. Claire once pulled away during a conversation that got too close, too fast. Edward once froze when she mentioned her ex-husband's name, still unsure what was safe to ask. But they kept showing up, kept choosing presence over performance. That made all the difference. One afternoon, while walking near a lake, Claire suddenly stopped. Edward turned, worried. "You okay?" She nodded slowly. Then, after a beat, she reached for his hand. He didn't speak. He just held it, and they kept walking. It had been exactly 1 year since the wedding at Willow Creek Ranch, the day that started with a lie and ended in silence, the day that shattered something before it had a chance to truly begin. Edward Kane never forgot it, not because of the humiliation or the fallout, but because it was the day he realized who Claire Bennett really was, and, more importantly, who he wanted to be with her. He didn't say anything to her in the days leading up to the anniversary. He simply invited her on a weekend trip, a little escape. He said, "No pressure, just trees, stars, and maybe terrible coffee." Claire had agreed, her smile soft but questioning. She hadn't asked for details. She didn't need to. She trusted him now in a way that meant more than any title or promise. They drove out of Boulder just after noon on Friday, Claire behind the wheel this time. Edward leaned back, watching the clouds shift over the mountains, the way her hair moved slightly in the breeze from the open window. They reached Montana by evening, but not just any part of Montana. When they turned off the main road and pulled into Willow Creek Ranch, Claire's eyes widened. "Edward," he smiled. "I asked if I could rent part of the property for the weekend. Just the back field. No ceremony, no crowd. Just us." Claire stepped out of the car slowly. It was different now. No wedding decorations. No white chairs, just open space, wildflowers, and the low hum of summer insects. The sun was beginning to set, casting gold over the tall grass. A table had been set beneath a tree, draped in linen, a small bouquet of sunflowers in the center. 2 wooden chairs, nothing else. Claire looked at it, then at him. "I thought maybe," Edward said, "it was time we made a new memory here." They ate dinner under the tree, simple food, homemade sandwiches, a bottle of the wine they both liked. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. As the sun dipped lower, Edward stood. "I want to show you something." He led her to a small patch of wild lavender a few yards away. The scent drifted gently in the air. Then, from his jacket, he pulled out a small box. Claire froze. He didn't get down on one knee. Not yet. He just held the box in his hand and looked at her. "This isn't about making a big gesture," he said quietly. "It's not about proving anything or outdoing anyone. It's about this year, about every Wednesday coffee, every quiet walk, every moment you didn't have to stay, but chose to." Claire's breath caught. "I lied once," he continued. "I pretended to have something I didn't. But now, this is real. You're real. And I don't want another year to go by where I don't tell you what you mean to me." He opened the box. Inside was a silver ring, no diamond, just a simple band, engraved with a tiny line of text, "Begin again." Claire stared at it, then at him. "I'm not asking for a wedding next month," he said. "I'm asking if I can keep choosing you every day, and if you'll choose me too." For a long moment, Claire said nothing. The wind picked up, brushing against her hair. Then, slowly, she stepped forward and reached for his hand. "You didn't have to bring me here," she whispered. "I know," he said, "but I'm glad you did." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It wasn't flashy, it didn't sparkle, but it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Edward pulled her into a quiet embrace. They stood there, listening to the wind and the memories, and the silence that, for once, didn't feel empty. Claire looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "So, does this make me your real girlfriend now?" Edward smiled. "No," he said. "This makes you my future." That night, they sat beneath the stars, side by side, wrapped in the same old quilt from Claire's porch. They didn't talk about what came next. They didn't need to, because sometimes love doesn't arrive with thunder or fanfare. Sometimes it arrives with a mistake, then stays because of the courage to fix it. Life doesn't always give us second chances, but sometimes we can choose to give them to each other. Edward and Claire's story reminds us that people are complex, and so are the reasons behind their actions. We've all made decisions we regret out of pride, pain, or fear of being alone. But what defines us isn't the mistake, it's what we do afterward. Edward's journey from manipulation to humility shows that true love isn't something we control or stage. It's something we learn to grow into through presence, through honesty, and through showing up again and again. For those of us who've lived long enough to carry both joy and heartache, this story offers a gentle truth. It's never too late to begin again, to say I was wrong, to choose kindness over ego, to love not because someone completes us, but because they reflect who we want to become. In the quiet chapters of life, where the noise fades and the heart speaks louder, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is believe in love one more time. Thank you for spending time with us and walking through this heartfelt story. If it touched something in you, if it reminded you of a moment, a feeling, or someone you once knew, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who might need it, and subscribing to the channel for more stories that speak to the heart. Your support means more than words can say. Until next time, stay kind, stay open, and keep believing in second chances.